welcome to my little channel. My name is Thomas Alexander, and today I want to tie a knot into this whole AJ Deus Dome of the Rock conspiracy forgery theme on my channel. I think with the last couple of videos it's already become clear that there's really no basis to AJ Deus's speculations. The concrete pieces of evidence that he provided all turned out to be contradictory to what he actually claimed they say. So there really is no basis for any further discussion really. But there are some things that I didn't touch on in my previous videos. Some things that I got wrong myself and I want to correct. And also I want to briefly touch on why the traditional dating just makes more sense. Now originally I wanted to tie that into my upcoming videos where I talk about what I think the origins of the Dome of the Rock looked like, when it was built, why it was built, and what it meant to the people who built it. But after finding out that AJ's claims are completely baseless, I figured that in my upcoming video I want to be completely independent of anything AJ Deus. I believe that his conjecture will be forgotten in a few weeks' time, and I want my videos to stand on their own, so that you don't need the context of AJ Deus's work. That's why I want to bring some points in now. So let's jump straight in. As you can see on the right side of your screen, I already have prepared some pictures. On the top right you can see a page from a psalter. It's the psalter of Melisande. She was the queen of the kingdom of Jerusalem. The psalter was created around 1135 in the city of Jerusalem. What is depicted here is how Mary presents baby Jesus, and in the background we can see the Dome of the Rock, which of course symbolizes the Temple of Solomon. I've already touched on this before. During the Middle Ages, when people depicted biblical stories, they moved them into their own time, so it makes sense that they would depict the Dome of the Rock instead of the Temple of Solomon as it was described in the Bible, because the Dome of the Rock was the building that stood there in Jerusalem at that time. What's interesting here is that the inside of the Dome of the Rock is depicted. This is actually the only picture I could find of the inside of the Dome of the Rock. There may be others. I couldn't find any, at least not as early as this one. Let's zoom a bit in, and we can here clearly see how the arcades are depicted. Here we have our floral motifs along the arches. I've got here down here a photograph of how the Dome of the Rock looks like today, and again here with the arches with our floral motifs. Now obviously our picture above is not photorealistic in any way, shape or form, but we can sort of make out the intent of the artist. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that of course the colors aren't perfectly accurate either, which probably has partially to do with the fact that the background here is all in gold. So making those arches in gold, for instance, wouldn't have worked. So instead they used the green color of the mosaics as the base color up here, and then had these little squiggly lines to imitate the floral designs. And what's interesting here is that above those floral mosaics we can see this line with dots on it, and that's precisely where we can see the inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock today. So this is a strong indication that the inscription was there in 1135. The artist obviously couldn't read it. Maybe he didn't even understand that there was an inscription. Maybe he just took it as ornamental, because we can't assume that the Christians could all read or even recognize the Kufic script. Either way, he indicated that something is there, and then above the script we have this red section with the yellow circles. Now that's again reflected here in our photograph right underneath the roof, and above this inscription we have these circles, these golden circles. So basically that tells us, yeah, the inscription in all likelihood was present in 1135, and there's no reason to think that it was different than today. Why do I say that? I mean, after all, it was established that there is no evidence outside those inscriptions pointing to those inscriptions or telling us what they say until very, very late, until the 19th century. And as far as I know, that is in fact true. So H.J. Deus is right with his claim there. There is no outside evidence for this inscription. But it's not like the inscription itself isn't evidence, it's clearly primary evidence. And it tells us that it was created in 691 AD. And by and large, dedicatory inscriptions on buildings don't lie. There's just no point, because people see when a building is being built, they know if the inscription is true or not. It's very difficult to forge this kind of thing. Everybody would know about it. What's more, the fact that al-mamun changed the name, right? So if you remember, the original inscription in the Dome of the Rock, down here, was altered. So we can tell because, for one, the name of the caliph who supposedly built the Dome of the Rock, who is named in this inscription, is al-mamun. He lived 200 years after the Dome of the Rock was being built, or 150 years. But also, he needed more space to put his name in, so the script is squeezed a little bit where his name appears, and also the tiles that are being used are slightly different than the tiles that were used for everything else. So clearly a change was made at some point. Since the name that was added is al-mamun, it makes sense that a change was made in his time, and that the underlying inscription is much older. Since it tells us it's 691, it kind of makes sense as well. But there's of course more. The script that is being used is the Kufic script that was in use in the late 7th century, so the script itself also fits the inscription. And in other places in the Dome of the Rock, along the drum, for instance, there are later inscriptions made by the Ayyubid dynasty or the Fatimid dynasty, and they all use different scripts. They all use the scripts of their time, not the Kufic script, like in the arcades where the dedication is located. So again, it makes perfect sense that we assume those inscriptions are from 691. And lastly, if you want to postulate that it's all a forgery, then you have to explain the motive. Why would anybody do this? Why would somebody put in an inscription and then change it to have a different name in there? Why would they backdate the Dome of the Rock? Why would they put in an Abbasid caliph of all people? If the Ottomans wanted to make a forgery here, why not put in the name of Umar? That would have made sense to give it like the appearance of a very old building. Why put in the name al-mamun with a wrong date? Or if it wasn't about backdating it too much, why not put in an Ottoman name to improve their standing? So what's the motive here? It just doesn't work. Whereas if we go with a classical story that the Abbasids wanted to exterminate Umayyad names, then it all makes sense. Then the inscription was originally made by al-malik and his name was erased by al-mamun, just like the inscription basically tells us itself through its appearance. And also, of course, if we assume it's all a forgery, why are the other inscriptions in there in a different script? Why are there inscriptions from Ayyubid times, from Fatimid times? What about the inscriptions that can't be seen? So there are dedications on wooden beams in the roof construction, which are dated. What about them? Are they a forgery too? Basically, from start to finish, this conspiracy theory doesn't make any sense. We have primary evidence in the form of those inscriptions, and they do all agree with the evidence on the ground, with the script, with the historical facts. So there's no reason to assume anything else than what's really presented here. Okay, so much for the inscription, but I also want to have another look at some of the pictures I've shown before, and also show you some new pictures, because I did find out some interesting new things that weren't part of my previous videos, which I think I definitely need to share with you, because it's just really cool stuff. Let's start with our friend Jan van Eyck. So if you remember, this is the painting that he drew, the Three Marys at the Tomb. It was painted around 1440, and here, first of all, I have to correct myself. So here, I think I made a mistake when I last covered it, and I was a bit dismissive. First of all, if you remember, Eyck Deus wrote in his paper that this painting was attributed to Hubert van Eyck, and I just said that he was wrong and it was attributed to Jan van Eyck. In a sense, we were both right here. In the past, this painting has been attributed to Hubert van Eyck. Nowadays, it's pretty much consensus that it was Jan van Eyck, but the English Wikipedia site, for instance, still attributes it to Hubert van Eyck, so it's understandable how he could have made that error. But what's more, as I said, I was a bit dismissive of this evidence. Let's zoom in a little bit. If you remember, he painted the Dome of the Rock with an octagonal drum, which was a big deal for A.J. Deus. Now, I think the topic of the octagonal drum, we've dealt with that. So the written records and the images that we have clearly point to it being round. But this is still interesting nonetheless. So why is there an octagonal drum here? In the last video, I said that in all likelihood Jan van Eyck was not an eyewitness, and I have since revised that opinion. I mean, we still don't know for sure, but I think there's a good chance that he actually was an eyewitness. The argument that is made is that the relation of the Dome of the Rock in the foreground and the Holy Sepulchre in the background just matches the real situation there, and it would be quite the coincidence if somebody who wasn't an eyewitness, or who at least didn't have access to eyewitness drawings, detailed eyewitness drawings, if he produced something like that. So that alone is a strong indication. But also in this previous video where we looked at the imagery, I said that Jan van Eyck went on a special mission sent by the Duke of Burgundy, in whose employ he was at the time. And I said that some people believe that special mission was a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, as it turns out, we actually know that he was sent on a pilgrimage. We don't know to where. So the special mission was indeed a pilgrimage. Of course, it could have gone to anywhere, but given that he was in the employ of the Duke of Burgundy, who was the richest man in Europe and the most powerful man in Europe at the time, it seems plausible that if he sent his men on a pilgrimage, it would be to the number one site, and that is, of course, Jerusalem. Also, at that time, Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, was contemplating to go on another crusade. And it is believed that that's why he sent Jan van Eyck there, to basically give him detailed information about the city, which he could then use once he arrives with his army. Now, that crusade never happened, so there's that. But if we combine all this evidence, it seems plausible, if not even likely, that Jan van Eyck was an eyewitness. In fact, I think I would now say there's a good chance that he was an eyewitness, which then raises the question, why the octagonal drum, right? So if he was an eyewitness, and if you got, for instance, here this relation between the Dome of the Rock and the Holy Sepulchre so right, why did he get the drum so wrong? And this is a really cool story. So I looked into Jan van Eyck, and particularly into this picture some more, and what I found is that this was probably a painting which was commissioned for a private chapel. So this is the inside of the chapel of the Adonis family in Bruges. Now, Bruges is the city that Jan van Eyck eventually settled in. That was in the 1430s, which, by the way, was after Hubert van Eyck died. So again, Hubert van Eyck probably has nothing to do with this painting. Now, in 1427, the Adonis family asked the Pope to build a chapel for their private home, and apparently he gave them permission. And this chapel was dedicated to Jerusalem. So as we can see on this picture here, for instance, we have the three crosses, again a clear reference to Jerusalem. Here we have another picture from the same chapel. Here we have the cross of Jerusalem. So apparently this Adonis family was very taken in by the city of Jerusalem, by all its holy sites. There are references all throughout this chapel. And we also know the family is still around, and we have an itinerary from the early days, and there were two Jan van Eyck paintings in there. We don't know which ones, but it seems likely that this painting above originally was painted for the chapel below. Another reason to assume that is if we look at the bottom right of this picture, let's zoom in some more, we can see a coat of arms. what's on there here, of course, are shells, and shells were the symbol of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So pilgrims to Jerusalem, they would put shells on their clothing, and then also they would put shells on their coat of arms to show that they went to Jerusalem. It was a big deal. Now this is actually not the official coat of arms of the Adornes family, but it was also used by them, which we can see. And I have got another picture from inside their chapel. And if you look here at this coat of arms, that's exactly the one from the painting, the pilgrimage coat of arms. So again, it all points to Jan van Eyck being commissioned to paint this painting for the chapel. But now comes the cool bit, because when we look at the outside of the chapel, we will find something very interesting. There it is, located in the center of Bruges, and of course immediately obvious is what's on top of the tower. It is in the design of Greek architecture, of a Greek dome, as it would have been common in Jerusalem. As I've already told you, this chapel was dedicated to Jerusalem. In fact, it's called the Jerusalem Chapel. And they've also made it visible on the outside by adding this dome-like wooden structure on top. And now if we compare those two, you can see that the details are amazingly similar. The way these little arches are made. So I mean, there are of course differences. So for one, this dome-like thing on top of the tower of the chapel is a bit stretched out, because the tower itself isn't a perfect square; it's a rectangle. So they matched this aspect ratio for this dome on top of the tower, which then also means that the arches here aren't identical, like on all 8 sides. So here we only have 2, and then here we have 4. But the general design of these arches has been taken up by Jan van Eyck here, clearly. The general shape is that of this rooftop dome. And that makes sense. If you had a rich patron who commissioned a painting, they typically want to be in there in some fashion. So very often you have biblical motifs where somebody who's in there is made to look like the patron who paid for the artist. And in this case, the Dome of the Rock has been painted to match the roof of the chapel wherein it was placed. So yeah, fascinating story here, and yeah, I was really surprised to find this. But yeah, now it all makes sense. So why did he paint an octagonal drum, even though he saw that it was round? Well, because of the Adornes family who paid for it. Another interesting find I made after my video was already done is in relation to this woodcut here. If you remember, this is a woodcut again which H.A. Deus is used to argue for an octagonal drum. You can see the Dome of the Rock here. There's clearly an octagon here. And he also argued that this is evidence for scaffolding, which he interpreted as being evidence for the Dome of the Rock being under construction at the time. So I'm not quite sure when this woodcut was made. This picture here is taken from the 1614 edition from Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia. There were early editions though. The earliest edition is from 1544, and that one doesn't have this woodcut, so it must have been made sometime after 1544. But I couldn't check out all the editions, so it was created sometimes between 1544 and 1614. Now in my original video I've already shown that this is a derivative work and that the original one, well, it's actually a combination between the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here. This one is taken from the Breitenbach book, and then all the rest is taken from this woodcut here. This was done by Herman van Borculo in 1538. So clearly preceding the one above, because this one was definitely made after 1544. And yeah, all the details match in both pictures except for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here, which was taken from the Breitenbach book. Okay, but what I didn't know at the time when I made my original video here on the relation between those two woodcuts was what's the source for the woodcut below. I said that Herman van Borculo was not an eyewitness, and that is true, he was not an eyewitness. But I didn't know where he got his information from, like how did he make this woodcut. So what I did was I actually looked more into Herman van Borculo. Who was he? What do we know about him? And I found an entry in the Winkler Prince Encyclopedia, so that is sort of the Dutch equivalent of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And since he's a Dutch artist, that makes sense. And what I found out is that he was the first book printer in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And he wasn't a pilgrim who went to Jerusalem. But the article in the Winkler Prince Encyclopedia also specifically mentioned the woodcut here on the bottom. It is his most famous work. That was good for me because in the encyclopedia it was also mentioned that he didn't do this alone, but that he cooperated with Jan van Scorel, who is another Dutch artist who lived in Utrecht, just like Herman van Borculo. And Jan van Scorel indeed was a pilgrim to Jerusalem. He was an eyewitness. So I looked up Jan van Scorel, and indeed he made a famous painting of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And that one looks like this. Here we are. So we can see here Jesus coming down towards Jerusalem, and in the back we have the city. So the general layout is just like in the Van Borculo woodcut, and then also like in the woodcut from the Sebastian Münster Cosmographia. The angle is slightly different. The painting in the bottom is of course more tuned towards realism, whereas the woodcut is more about giving you a cityscape. So there are some differences, but the basic shape and layout is the same. And if we zoom in, we can see the Dome of the Rock. And not only does it have a round drum, again unsurprising at this point, we've seen all the evidence, but it really looks like the Dome of the Rock today, with the exception of the blue tiles. They were added later by the Ottomans. But we can tell, so the Dome of the Rock definitely looked like it does today back then. And now here we have the complete chain, right? So it starts out with our man Jan van Scorel. He is an eyewitness. He saw the Dome of the Rock, he saw Jerusalem, and he made the painting which you can see here in the year 1525. Then a few years later, based on his painting and presumably also on his personal input, I mean they were almost neighbors after all, Herman van Borculo made this woodcut down here. And then a few years later, the artist who was hired by Sebastian Münster for his Cosmographia copied the Van Borculo woodcut for Sebastian Münster's book. So we have a chain of 3 copies. It gets ever more octagonal, so the Dome of the Rock gets ever more octagonal. But we can see the eyewitness drew it as being round. Again, really interesting stuff. I couldn't have I wouldn't have expected for it to be that obvious, but it is. Okay, and lastly, I want to look at one more picture that should be familiar to us now. Again, this is a picture we've looked at in my video on the drawings of the Dome of the Rock. And this time I'm once again trying to make the case that Erhard Reubich, who made this woodcut, tried to make a round dome. And to do so, trying something slightly different this time. So here is the same Dome of the Rock from the same picture as above. It's just that I've desaturated the colors a little bit so we can highlight some things more easily. And first of all, we have to keep in mind what we're looking at. So this is not intended to depict reality. This is sort of a map of Palestine, and then Israel is highlighted in the center. So even on top, if you look at this depiction, so there is a lot missing. So this is a fold out from the book, and it goes like on both sides. It goes quite far off, and it's basically a map. It's just that in the place of Jerusalem, this is the scale is increased here, so it looks much bigger than all the other cities. So for instance, down here is a city, and those are cities, and so on. But Jerusalem is much bigger, and then within Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock is of course highlighted as the central monument, much bigger in scale than everything else. And that's because the closest thing we can compare this type of depiction to in our modern day are cartoons. Because what you do in cartoons is you take something that's very characteristic for whatever you want to depict and you exaggerate it. And that's what's being done here. So Jerusalem is being exaggerated compared to everything else. The Dome of the Rock is being exaggerated compared to Jerusalem. And then if you look at the Dome of the Rock, for instance, the cupola, the onion shape is also being exaggerated. It's just sort of the genre of painting here. So you shouldn't expect realism anyway. So it doesn't really matter what Erhard Reuvig did. I mean, the accompanying text itself in the same book describes it as being round. So really, it doesn't matter what he did here. It's clearly round, and we've seen it also now in other pictures and in reliefs and so on. So clearly, the Dome of the Rock was always round. But still, I think we can show that Erhard Reuvig probably wanted to draw a round drum. And to do that, as I said, we have this picture here below, and I've highlighted some of the lines that he drew. So here again, I just highlighted the lines by Erhard Reuvig. I didn't change anything. And what we can see here is that again, this line down here at the foot of the drum is almost a perfect straight line. I mean, it does bend around slightly, but barely. It's almost a straight line. And then in this last segment, it moves up, it bends upwards. So if you just take what's depicted here, it's neither an octagon nor a circle. It's an impossible shape, basically. So whatever we do, we have to interpret the picture that's on the screen. And what is important to understand when interpreting it is, of course, also this label which is put on top. So this says Templum Salomonis. The two horizontal lines here and here indicate that what follows is an M or an N. This is just a writing convention of those days. So it says Templum Salomonis. And clearly Erhard Reuvig wanted to label the Dome of the Rock. But with the label, he didn't really have the room to do either a circle or an octagon shape here, right? So what I've done next is I've highlighted the lines as they would look like if Erhard Reuvig intended to do an octagon. And one thing to keep in mind before we go there is here to the left of the leftmost support pillar, there's still a bit of wall. And with an octagon, that wouldn't work. You always, because you're dealing with straight lines, they always sort of meet at the place of a support column. At least if there are support columns like there are here, right? Obviously here we have these support columns. So and if you have those, then they always meet at a support column. So no matter from where you look at the Dome of the Rock, if it had an octagonal drum, at both ends, to the left and to the right, you would see one of those support columns. If you don't see one, that means that the wall here curves around. So that's an indication for a round wall. So if Reuvig intended to do an octagon, well, the first thing we would have to change is we would have to get rid of this extra bit of wall, because it has to end in one of those support columns. We would have to extend those support columns into this label, right? So that's why he didn't do it. And then we would draw straight lines in between those support columns to indicate we're dealing with an octagon here. Another thing that we immediately see is when we do this, and now let's zoom out a little bit again. Now the drum doesn't align anymore with either the ambulatory below or the cupola above. It's no longer centered because we had to get rid of this bit here. Also, the support columns do not align with the edges of the ambulatory. Instead, they align with their center, which is actually what they do in the real life. So if you look at the picture of the Dome of the Rock, it does have support columns which don't align with the edges of the ambulatory, but with the center. But if we have two octagons and they do not align, so they basically twisted in against each other, that really would look very weird, and we wouldn't expect this back then. Maybe in some postmodern architecture, but not in like medieval times. For instance, like the roof line, the roof from the ambulatory is coming up towards the drum. If the drum is an octagon, it would look really strange. We would have like really weird shapes there, because those two octagons wouldn't align. Now what about if you had tried to do a round drum but wouldn't have had to deal with the label? Well, then it would look something like this. So we can keep our leftmost segment. We still have to extend some of our support columns, and then we add a round line to indicate the foot of the round drum. And I think from this we can see that this is the much likelier explanation for what we see here, because we need to change less to make this possible. All that has happened is sort of he wanted to do a round drum, but he had to squeeze it up a bit in order to make room for the label. And that then explains why on the picture above, when you don't look too close, it may appear as being an octagon, even though it probably was never intended to be one. But yeah, I mean, again, the text itself explains that it's round, so there shouldn't be much confusion here anyway. But I thought I want to show you here this connection between the label and having to squeeze the drum a little bit here. Okay, and with that, I hope we're at the end of the entire Deus saga. Let's see. But next up would be my positive case, where I try to explain what likely happened. Who built the Dome of the Rock? When was it built? Why was it being built? What's the symbolism behind it? And how did all of that change over time? Because there were some changes, both in meaning as well as physically inside the Dome of the Rock. But nowhere near as drastic as Deus says there were. And there are much better explanations than a conspiracy theory about a Jewish serpent king or whatever. No point in going into this anymore. I think that theory is done and dusted. So yeah, let's look ahead. And if you like what you saw, I would totally appreciate it if you could leave a like, if you could comment. That always helps the algorithm. Of course, you should subscribe if you aren't already, and maybe you know some people who may also like my content, and if you could forward it to them. Word of mouth is always the best. What's more, obviously I do have my Patreon account, so if you feel there's value in what I'm doing, I would really appreciate it if you could support me. I'm thankful for all the people who already are, and yeah, they help keep this channel going. So thanks a lot, and yeah, see you next time.